Hi, I'm Colin Moore, a landscape architect and urban designer. These talks are organised by FOLAR in a series for MERL, and FOLAR are the Friends of the Landscape Archive at Reading. And that archive is housed at MERL, Reading University. FOLAR have actually got a new website, folar.uk, where you can find out all about us, as well as access recordings of these talks, as well as our previous annual symposia and other events, including a talk on Michael Brown's work for children's play as part of the 2019 FOLAR Symposia on Play. I'm the secretary of FOLAR, so I've got a vested interest in saying, please join us. We would appreciate your support. We're a very active, small, enthusiastic little group which tries to do as much as possible. Right, today I'm talking about Michael Brown landscapes, detailed delight. And I'm going to start with a quote from Michael's obituary that appeared in The Independent, which was written by Tom Stewart Smith. Michael Brown was one of the most distinguished landscape architects since the Second World War. He designed the landscape setting for many celebrated metropolitan public housing developments of the late 60s and 70s, and his practice became the acknowledged leader in the field. He was a dogged eccentric who got his way because of an almost messianic conviction in his approach to design. And I chose this picture for the front because it's typical Michael. It reminds me 1000% of the Michael I knew. I worked for Michael for a year, 1973 to 4, and then on and off all through my studies at Sheffield University, where I studied landscape architecture. And I actually worked a day a week for Michael, crossing the Pennines to a site in Stalybridge near Manchester. And we may get onto that towards the end if I don't run out of time. So a little on Michael's professional life. He was born in 1922, studied architecture at Edinburgh, with a break in the middle for military service in the Second World War. And at the same time, he had an internship, or just after, he had an internship with Sir Basil Spence, architects who were doing Coventry Cathedral at that time. And then he moved to London and LCC Architects, who were doing a lot of council housing projects at that time. Married 1954, moved to America in 1955 and to study the University of Pennsylvania landscape architecture under Ian McHarg. And he worked several practices at the same time. When he left, worked for Dane Kiley in Vermont, and went back to teaching under Ian McHarg at University before moving back to the UK. On the photos on the previous slide are from Pennsylvania, and in the second one he's working with his wife on a model. He was a very serious young man. He didn't have much of a smile in the photos of the early days. Later on, he's smiling all the time. When he got back to the UK, he worked firstly in an architect's office in Oxford, but then for Eric Lyons on span housing projects, and the main one that Michael worked on was Field End. And in fact, Michael lived in one of the houses on Field End for a few years. In 1962, He set up his own practice, Michael Brown Landscape Architects. He started from home in Field End, then moved to Kew Road in Richmond, and then 38 Hill Rise, Richmond. And after, it set up a partnership in 1974 with Brian King, and that was dissolved in 1981. And he continued to practice, or reverted to, Michael Brown Landscape Architects, operating from St Margaret's Road, Twickenham, which is not far from his office that was in Richmond. The two things on this list that I don't know very much about at all, which is something that somebody needs to research. One is Conference and Field Studies Centre in New Mills, Luxborough, Somerset, which I know very, very little about. And then later on, there's a whole thing about research into sustainable communities, including trips to India, China, USA, etc. And he was a founder member of the Sustainable Villages Group. And I know very little about it at the moment. So if anybody knows much about it, I would like to hear. And it's an area that needs research. He retired in 1991 to Oxfordshire, continued with the research, but it was unfortunately cut short when he died in 1996. Now I'm going to go through loads of projects, loads of pictures, images of drawings, and starting with Field End, the span scheme that he worked on there at Lyons in the 50s. This was taken in 1974 and is the entrance road. It's actually in Teddington, still there, still looking good, a few less trees. But the one really striking thing about the estate then was that in the middle it had a grove of birch trees. And you can see all the houses around on this photograph. But it was like houses in a birch grove. Most of those birch are now gone. Presumably they got too dense and some died and cut out a lot of light, but most have gone. But the estate is still really good, worth a visit. It has a very active residents association. They have a website, fieldend.com. The project's Brunel, which it did as Michael Brown Landscape Architects. This is one of the best schemes for showing Michael's design philosophy, and it is still there, intact. A few bits have gone and there are a few changes, but it is essentially intact. It's next to Westbourne Park Tube Station, west of Paddington, on old railway land, obviously, hence the name Brunel Estate. And essentially it's a lot of landscape spaces linked with sunken paths. Most of the spaces are sunken, mound grass areas with trees in between. And it uses all of the details that Michael became well known for, that he used on many, many projects, typically brick paving, brick steps, brick slopes. So the footpaths through the landscape are sunken with brick slopes on either side. And the spaces are either sitting spaces or play spaces the one towards the top of this is a play space for toddlers, and there's a sitting space to the left and the right of it. So this is one of the paths with the slopes on either side and the mounds and the trees and buildings beyond. It's 2017 photograph. All the trees have grown, and actually the children's play area has been removed and a new one put in. It's not very well designed, but that's one of the significant changes. But the brickwork has survived extremely well, and has actually been repaired in places to match. On the left is a toddler's play area towards the top. But towards the bottom, you've got a sitting space, very typical of Michael. It gravitates to the centre. The whole of the paving pattern is focused on the centre as a sort of spiral. Similar sort of spirals go around trees, and it's sloped sides as well and sunken, so it's enclosed, feels a static space rather than something on top of a hill, which is much more fluid. But the footpaths are linear links, which are much more fluid. So note the trees, how small they are. They've just been planted. They are semi-mature and in those days, semi-mature trees weren't very available. They were only just becoming available. There was really only one nursery that was doing them, and they weren't particularly good compared with trees these days, but they do grow, as you can see on the right, which shows the main footpath access, which runs right through the site and is actually a public footpath, again with slopes on either side. That's that small toddler's play area. You wouldn't get away with design like that these days. And if you look on the left, you'll actually see a black sort of letterbox in the brickwork and little metal posts at the top, which are for the children to climb up, foot in the letterbox hole and pull up with the posts. And to the right of that, there are actually step irons so it can climb up the other slope. You'll see another photo later where those step irons and everything are very visible. And in the center of the photo at the top, that's a tower block. Many of these developments at that time had a tower block and other linear 6 to 8 story linear blocks. And sometimes there were the smaller houses and maisonettes, which Brunel has, but many of the others didn't. Very typical estate of that period. I was employed by Michael as a clerk of works for one particular project, and then went on to work doing site work on almost every project that was in the office at the time. And on Brunel, I actually set out the brickwork with the bricklayers for that slide area because they were a bit confused as to how to do it. But this photo is typical Michael. Steps, brick steps, a standard detail of his. This one is slightly modified from the standard. The main standard just had one row of bricks behind the brick on edge tread. This has got 2 rows of bricks, but the sort of edges of a slope on one side and the wall on the other, very, very typical. Shown in a standard detail. Michael had loads of standard details of the standard sort of situations that occurred. This is one of the most standard ones used on many, many, many projects. And these were produced on A4 tracing paper and then copied onto negative for projects copied on the back, and it's a die line process, which is why there is the bluish drain over the whole drawing. This is actually a slide photograph of the detail, which has cut off the title block at the bottom and the sides and part of the drawings and writing. But there are some details later which are the full details, like this one. This is another set of steps. You can see the section at the bottom, which is obviously a set of steps, and a cross section across step at the top with slope on either side. But it's a very strange detail when you really look at it closely. I'm not going to go through looking at it closely. What I am going to talk about is the yellow strip at the bottom, which you can't actually read, but it's the title block. On the left it says Michael Brown Landscape Architects and the address, which is 38 Hill Rise. Although it's 1968 drawing, so it's probably 39 Kew Road. Now this is the original tracing paper that has been scanned, the tracing paper drawing, and the title block will have been stamped on the back with one of those rubber stamps like the old date stamps, stamped on a pad of ink and then stamped on the drawing. And it's done on the back so that it doesn't interfere with the drawing, and it's done in yellow because yellow printed very, very black when you did a die line print. So these drawings go back, they're of their time. Die line printing and all of that sort of thing, which went long time ago, as Xerox copying took over. And then if you do a Xerox copy of it, of course, it'll look completely different. But it is a strange set of steps, this one, as you can see from the axonometric on the left. And it is so strange that that's how it looked when it was built. And it leads up to the back of the slide that we were looking at in a previous photo. But all of this area is gone, being filled in, new playground. More steps, stepped ramps, this one. Much longer treads, and the whole thing ramped as well. This is in another play area on the estate. But the detail is essentially the same. Just extended the tread and sloped it. And it's just to the left of this. It is still there. The photo on the right is 2017. The one on the left is about 1974. You will see all the way up the slopes to the right side on the left, the hole to put your foot in and the grab post to pull yourself up, and the step irons, they're manhole step irons to climb up the slope, all the way up the slope and go up. And then there's some steps with very high risers to get to the top and come down the slide. All of those have been taken out, and railings everywhere, which actually make it more dangerous simply because the fall heights are greater than they were on the original. It also takes the sort of play element of climbing back up the slopes entirely out of the scheme. The only piece of rubber material to absorb impact on this whole project is actually at the bottom of this slide. There were some tiles, rubber tiles, which nowhere near thick enough. They're about 5-10 millimeters thick, something like that. So it didn't do the job at all. But since the 2017 photograph, They have actually put in a impact absorbing material at the bottom that is yellow, bright yellow colour, which is rather odd. But so you can slide down into a sea of custard instead of a black hole. Another project, Mozart Street. Mozart Street and Herries Street are north of Brunel, near or just south of Queen's Park Station. They both 90% been demolished. They were a problem from the very beginning with leaking roofs and all of that sort of stuff, but also antisocial behaviour. The estate was apparently between two gangs, so they fought over it for a while, and then apparently there became a Mozart Street gang. But I'm going to read a bit of an article from the BBC by Kevin Young of 30th of September 2011, which was titled Postcode Wars, Blight, Mozart Street. Bathed in blazing sunshine, the tree-lined streets full of cottage-style terraced houses do not appear to be a hotbed of inter-gang rivalry. But the atmosphere in the streets south of Queen's Park Station in northwest London, where three young women, one of them cradling her baby son, were shot on Thursday, changes radically by night. That was actually in part of the Mozart estate which wasn't demolished. The majority was demolished and redeveloped, as was Herries Street. This is another photo of the area, all Michael's standard sort of details, tree pits, railings, slopes, his bench seats, are all standard details, not the slide. Another standard detail which actually shows how to do the brickwork around a curve on the brick slope, so you don't get massive joints at the bottom of the slope, with all the radii worked out, and of course it's all in feet and inches back in the day. The slight coloration is because tracing paper degrades. It gets brittle and it can also colour with age. I don't think I have to say much about this one, except please don't fall off the top. There is no impact absorbing material at all. And there's the detail of it. Long section on the top left, plan underneath it. And on the right, a section of the bottom part of the slide where the sides turn down. Obviously on the main part of the slide, the edges of the slide turn up, but at the bottom they turn down to enable you to come off the side if you wish. Hopefully not at speed. But of course, these slides used to occasionally be greased, typically with beeswax or something like that, or even wax polish, so that if you actually went down them, you came off the bottom at great speed, unless you wore your hands out and burnt them trying to stop yourself with the edges. Lots more details. This is top and bottom of slopes. All the different sorts of situations on Herries Street North. There was a north and south for Herries Street. Again, it's all A4. And ramps, stepped ramps. The bottom one is 100% brick and the top one is just putting brick nosings on the architect's ramps. These gates, they were used, this sort of standard details are used on many projects. was on the project that I was clerk of works on, but this one is in the Herries Street pack, although it doesn't actually have the job name on it. So it is probably the original standard detail. Very, very intricate detail, everything sorted out. All the details necessary to construct it. Michael also detailed all the curbs and roads to these estates. He did absolutely everything outside the buildings. The engineers just did the structural underneath and connected the gullies into the drainage system. Cross sections across roads with the gutters and the curbs and etc. Bollards as well, how it all fits together. This would want to be a sketch design. It's all done freehand. Many of these details are done freehand. Another project, Lancaster Road. Same sort of time. I mean, the office was exceptionally prolific at this time. It was built just after I left Michael, but drawings were all on the drawing board while I was there. It's a very similar estate to Brunel. It is still there, but it has, the management and maintenance of it has been exceptionally poor. This is just after it was built. The big tree on the left was obviously the original tree before the development, retained through the development. All the standard details again, the seats, the areas around the tree, slopes, brick paving. One of the other things that Michael did really well was grading grass areas, the contouring. He was meticulous about it, very meticulous. And I mean, there was a sort of sand model in the office where you could do all the contouring that you wanted with the sand and then transfer it to drawings, all of that sort of thing. And very meticulous when it was done on site to make sure it was right. On this project, the tops of the slope are quite pointed rather than very rounded, but it's just this project. But the whole thing was to create enclosure and raise the ground before the building so you could get trees with elevated height and screen buildings. And there's a picture in a couple of slides further on, which carries on to the right with this footpath. And this is a drawing of a slightly different area, but it does show the intricate contouring at the top of the plan. And it also shows why the tops of those slopes are quite pointed, because the contours are quite close together at the top of the contouring. But these things were pored over for hours to get the contouring right and the enclosure right for the spaces. And the building bit at the bottom, and it's a play area at the bottom at a lower level. The building at the very bottom is at a higher level, hard landscape leading up to the top of it and looking into the estate from the south, from the hard into the soft, which is where all of my photographs have been taken from the hard at the southern end. And this is that footpath again, sweeps back round to the area in the centre that we saw on the very first photograph taken in '74. So all the intricate grading, the area of grading that plan was of is just to the right of this bit. And then the area of hard landscape on the edge before you look into all the soft, They have changed all the brickwork to this porous sort of asphalt material, coloured asphalt material, which is a reasonable change. I suspect the brickwork moved all over the place. You can see the roots all around the tree, trying to escape out of the confined space. And in the brickwork towards the bottom, the wall and slope, you can see enormous crack and settlement. I have a vague thought that the area to the right of this picture is actually a building below, and that this is the trees even on top of the building, which would account for that big settlement, because it is in that area. This is the Hards area to the south, leading up to the area we were just looking at, and there is then a link straight into the building across to the right, which is on top of a building. So, and the green area is off to the left towards the tower block. And the only reason I put this picture in is because the tower block is Grenfell Tower, and it is part of the estate at the northern end. Different type of projects in the north of England. This is Manchester, Royal Northern College of Music, roof garden. You can see Michael on the left. I've never ever seen him in a suit except on this photograph. And I've never seen him wear a tie except to hold his trousers up. At my interview, his trousers were held up with a tie. I was trussed up in a very, very thick suit on a very, very hot day, feeling like an idiot. And Michael, of course, was totally informal, I mean. And it just really struck me that he's, rather than a belt, he had a tie holding his trousers up. Anyway, the person next to him is the mayor, and the roof garden was in memory of her daughter, I believe. And the next person towards the right, i.e. the one in the middle of the five, is Michael's wife, Joan. She designed and made the sculpture. This is the opening ceremony. I did a bit of work on this project whilst at Sheffield. I was sent to a nursery to select some large Amelanchier because Michael wasn't happy with the size of the plants on the scheme that had just been planted. So I selected 10 big, large Amelanchier, and the next day they were delivered to the site and planted. With me there, which is just one of the things that I did for Michael whilst I was at Sheffield. This is the other project I worked on a lot when I was in Sheffield. I went to this site once a week for 18 months, driving over the Pennines to Staley Hall, which actually is in Staley Bridge, just before Manchester. Very, very interesting project. I won't go into it too much, but basically the water came down off the hill and tried to wash everything away on several occasions, including when the topsoil had just been stripped. The topsoil had been stripped and stacked, and it was then rained for several days, and most of it washed back down the slope again. But next to it, there was also a primary school, and they didn't put adequate drainage in at the bottom of the slope, and it cut right through their newly graded sports pitch, cut a deep cleft all the way through it, which was taller than me. And washed all of the soil straight through the new primary school. So there's a bit of a hoo-ha about that. Camden Town Hall, something different, another roof garden, but it's actually on an underground car park. It is at ground level. This is, well, the plan at the bottom, at the top is article from probably a local newspaper and the photos from the newspaper. Something different, I think it's, they're actually refurbishing the building, so I don't, well, they were a year ago. I don't know whether it's still there or not. Be interesting to find out. This explains the codes that were used for specifying semi-mature trees, not on all projects, but on some projects. And it just illustrates how meticulous Michael could be, that you've got a full tree, a 3/4 and a 1/2 and a 1/4 in terms of plan shape, and then lots of different shapes and forms for crowns and whatever, and the codes that enabled you to specify which one you wanted. And you've also got 3 sizes of each, large, medium and small. It also illustrates the sort of process of production of standard details. The original for this would have been on tracing paper, of course. This is a copy negative onto film, printed on the back. And you can see up under the notes thing, scratching out, which have been taken off notes, either off the original, well, it will have been off the original. So it's scratching out on the back with a razor blade. And the sort of hue is from the dye line printing process. It looks like it's grey rather than blue. You could have grey, blue, or even brown. And new information has been put. I mean, the address looks like it's been changed, and that's in brown ink on the front. So the whole process of production of standard details through to a project detail can be seen on these drawings if you experienced it at the time, of course. Otherwise, you just wonder why it looks grey with white patches. Now, after Michael dissolved the partnership was in 1981. He just decided what really happened, I suppose, was that in the 70s, council housing got a bad name. The whole process of development and the types of development got a very bad name, and it actually stopped. So the majority of Michael's work will have just dried up. And he decided to dissolve the partnership, and he reverted back to working from home in Twickenham as Michael Brown Landscape Architects rather than a partnership. This is one of the projects he did, Foundation Park. There was an article in Landscape Design about it, so I went to see it in 1991. And the thing that instantly struck me was trees right next to buildings. They are exceptionally close to the buildings, touching the buildings. Very, very similar to field ends, sort of planting as trees right next to buildings. During that period, this is 1989. I was senior partner of practice called Moore, Piet and Brooks. And Michael had far too much work to do. He approached us, or he approached me, and said, have you got some time to help me out? Because his usual assistants were, or the practices that helped him were all busy. doing other jobs or other work for Michael, so he came to us to help him out. And there are actually 9 projects on the MPB job list from Michael, and this is one, the Swan Hotel, the River Thames, Streatley, and it's a water project essentially, recreation related to the hotel. And Mary Brooks, who was one of the partners of MPB, was an expert in water, flood alleviation and river restoration, all of that sort of stuff. And so she did it for Michael. We were what's called ghosting for Michael. So the client didn't know that another practice was doing the work. So Michael fronted the projects with the client and we did all the work. But this is from my records of MPB's work. This is my last slide. This is another one for Michael. I personally did this one for him. It was a competition. I just spent a day on, well, I went to see Michael one day for the brief for it. The next day I went to site and did all the survey and analysis on site, walking around in circles as you do. Quite large site. It was a pig farm, derelict. And the next day I did this drawing and delivered it to Michael first thing in the morning. In terms of, at 7:30 I was on the doorstep of the printers to get prints, then delivered it round to Michael for Michael to go to a meeting with the client in the middle of the morning. Fortunately, I didn't have to do any more work on it because the client really loved the drawing and it was submitted as part of the competition entry without any revisions whatsoever. But again, the drawing is quite interesting. The sort of writing has dropped out in places. That is because it's a pencil drawing, and with pencil, it's the weight that you apply to the pencil as you draw, which gives lines weight, makes them darker rather than lighter. And with the die line printing process, that worked fine because it printed out even the finest lines. As soon as you move to Xerox, you lose the finest lines, the weaker lines, or they start to break up, which is what has happened on this drawing. It's been produced on Xerox. It's been reduced from A1 down to A4 and then scanned. The other thing to note on the drawing, you see some of the lines that direct the words to their location, certainly on the left-hand side. You can see they're broken up. The explanation for that is because the drawing was drawn on a timber drawing board, and that's the grain that the pencil has picked up as it was drawn. So that's essentially my talk. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope Michael becomes better known than he is at the moment, because some of his work is extremely interesting and some of it is still there, but there are many, many projects that have been lost or are currently under threat. Ones that spring instantly to mind are Haygate, it's one of Michael's. There are few of his trees left. Graham Park, which is being redeveloped, Winstanley Road being redeveloped. So we're losing many of the projects that were done at that time, or have already lost them. The one I worked as clerk of works on went within 10 years of the project being finished, because it was, the play building was burnt down, the play structure was burnt down, and it became a leisure centre, redeveloped as a leisure centre. So what we have left, we need to try and keep. And I'm finished. Thank you.